20 years ago, a flood of low-tech, labor-intensive consumer goods poured out of Chinese factories and wiped out swaths of Western manufacturing. Today, policymakers are warning their citizens about a second China shock, but the mechanics of this modern threat are entirely different. The industrial capacity coming out of China right now targets the exact advanced intellectual property-heavy manufacturing sectors that the West has traditionally monopolized. Look at clean technology and advanced renewables. European firms once held unrivaled supremacy in solar and wind engineering. Now they are rapidly losing ground, outpaced by a scale and speed of industrialization that G7 powers are struggling to match. The political reaction has been severe. European leaders are returning from diplomatic trips to Beijing and delivering dire warnings to their own workforces. They tell domestic laborers to work harder and increase productivity if they want to avoid falling behind. This panic is driving the European Union to debate hasty defensive measures, like broad tariffs and trade wars. But building policy out of panic means these leaders are trying to block a threat without actually diagnosing how it works. If you ask a Western policymaker why China dominates the global market, you will almost always hear the same explanation. Beijing is flooding its industries with WTO-violating cash subsidies, and Chinese firms are relying on outdated intellectual property theft. This assumption is heavily tied to the aggressive political orientation toward technological autonomy that solidified over the last decade. It treats China's economic ascendance as a project built on cheating the established international system. We can test that consensus using quantitative data. The Rhodium Group, an independent American research provider, ran the numbers on the exact fiscal subsidies the Chinese government uses to support its electric vehicle sector. This waterfall chart breaks down the price difference between a European and a Chinese EV. Direct fiscal subsidies account for merely $60 to $120 per car. The massive thousands of dollars gap actually comes from immense supply chain scale, rapid logistics, and cheaper, highly skilled engineers. The data also invalidates the reverse engineering myth. The technology emerging from the Chinese value chain right now relies on original, high-quality patents. Western firms are the ones currently wondering how to reverse engineer Chinese innovations, like extreme low wind turbines and advanced battery swapping systems. Industrial strategies built primarily to counter cash handouts and IP theft ignore the actual drivers of China's price advantage. They target a phantom mechanism while leaving the real competitive gap unaddressed. To understand why Chinese firms can outprice the rest of the world, you have to look at how their state capitalism structurally engineers the market. It relies on two main pillars: massive demand management and an artificially lowered cost of capital. This feedback loop begins with the state's signaling mechanism. Through their 5-year plans, the government signals exactly which technology sectors will be prioritized, creating a zone of guaranteed domestic demand for things like solar panels, wind grids, and batteries. Then comes the financial layer. Roughly 80, and crucially, this high-pressure competition happens overwhelmingly within privately owned firms. These are listed companies, accountable to shareholders, not Soviet-style bureaucracies. Compare that ecosystem to Europe. Western governments largely refuse to engage in demand management. We let the market decide. As a result, foundational infrastructure, like a reliable, dense, nationwide EV charging grid, remains highly fragmented and underfunded. State-owned finance in China is a deliberate tool. It de-risks the enormous capital expenditures required to build entirely new global supply chains from scratch.
Europe recently attempted to mimic this ecosystem to build its own clean tech champion, a Swedish battery manufacturer called Northvolt. On paper, Northvolt successfully aligned a powerful coalition. It secured offtake agreements with major automakers like Volkswagen, who became shareholders, and received initial equity from the European Investment Bank and various pension funds. But industrial hardware requires something called hyperscaling. Moving from a successful startup to operating 5 massive physical factories requires bridging a highly vulnerable financial gap. Looking at this timeline, you can see what went wrong. Right in the middle of hyperscaling, Northvolt was hit by exogenous macroeconomic shocks. Ukraine-driven inflation spiked the cost of materials, and Germany's constitutional court unexpectedly halted a massive fund that subsidized EV purchases, drying up consumer demand. Here is where the European institutional framework failed. By law, the European Investment Bank cannot legally support a company in distress. Private capital dried up. Without a bridge loan to survive the inflation spike, Northvolt went bankrupt, liquidating despite 52 billion euros in secured orders. Compare that to NIO, a major Chinese EV manufacturer operating on highly advanced battery swapping technology. NIO hit a very similar scaling snag and faced potential collapse. Instead of letting the market kill the company, the local municipal government in Hefei stepped in, operating effectively as a localized venture capital fund. The state injected equity, fixed the balance sheet, and bridged the company through the crisis. Europe sends its industrial startups into the wild, where strict free market rules abandon them at the first sign of macroeconomic stress. Chinese state capital acts as a deliberate bridge across that valley of death. With Chinese clean tech dominating the market, the knee-jerk political reaction in the West has been to build massive tariff walls to block these products entirely. But there is a glaring contradiction in this strategy. The very European legacy automakers these tariffs are supposed to protect actively oppose them. Instead of decoupling, companies like Volkswagen and Stellantis are currently pouring billions into Chinese R&D hubs and buying massive equity stakes in Chinese EV firms. These legacy manufacturers know that to survive, they have to merge their traditional precision engineering with the highly advanced low-cost electronics and battery tech being developed in China. This map shows the risk of hard decoupling. If Europe and the US build thick tariff walls, Chinese exports will simply bypass them, completely dominating the global south. Locked out of emerging markets, shrinking European exports will starve legacy industries of required global scale. Strict protectionism risks creating a walled-off, uncompetitive market. Without the scale provided by the global south, European firms are left attempting to sustain older engine technologies while their global competitors move forward. There is a historical alternative between total free trade and total decoupling. For decades after World War II, global trade operated on embedded Keynesian arrangements. This means sector-by-sector managed trade. European negotiators can sit down with Chinese firms, offering market access, in exchange for technology sharing and the localization of supply chains on European soil. But bringing Chinese supply chains to Europe exposes a final, highly disruptive truth, especially for the manufacturing economies of Central and Eastern Europe. For 30 years, Eastern Europe relied on offering cheaper labor to Western automotive firms. Policymakers hope that forcing Chinese battery factories to relocate there will maintain that job market. That job boom will not materialize. Driven by a demographic crisis, the modern Chinese supply chain is built on embedded AI and intense robotics, practically eliminating the need for human labor. The shift toward automated EV manufacturing displaces labor at multiple levels. Robotics remove blue-collar assembly roles, while automated design processes displace white-collar engineering positions across the continent as the internal combustion engine is phased out. Surviving the second China shock necessitates a rigorous rethinking of modern social support. It moves the focus beyond trade adjustments toward how societies sustain labor and public goods in an automated era.